Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
Thank you, Sherry. My most ardent supporter in the nightly greeting. I appreciate it. I think everyone knows. I know everyone knows there are donuts. Please eat them. I have been bringing home far too many. I can't eat all of them. I could, but I don't. I have not yet eaten all of them. Welcome. Week 3. And, we were talking in the car. I don't want to jinx it. This isn't a super long lesson. So that's good. That's good. We can and have. Yeah, sometimes it's the shorter ones where we get off on very interesting tangents. We'll see what happens. Last week we talked about the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, and we talked about Lot and his daughters. So this week we're going to be covering 2 chapters, chapters 20 and 21, and these chapters form a sort of literary sandwich, if you will, because you're going to have interactions with Abraham and a Philistine ruler, and there are going to be 2 events that occur with that. So that's the first thing that happens and the last thing that happens. And then we're dealing with Abraham's 2 sons in between. So it's kind of this tight literary unit. Actually, the Gospel of Mark does that all the time. People actually refer to it as a Markan sandwich. So it's a well-known thing in the field. So again, this week, and I'll have to talk with Pastor about this, going through the text, our textbook, again, because they're trying to fly through so much material, everything was basically just a recap of what the scripture said. There was no standout things. So I'm hoping to be able to use them soon, because when we do use them, it's because they have good stuff. But the last couple weeks, there just hasn't been anything of note. So don't worry about that tonight, hopefully next week. But we will pray, and we can jump right in. Lord, we thank you for this day. We thank you for your word. Thank you for everyone who's able to make it out. And Lord, I just pray you'd be with us as we study your word. Pray you would help us to understand the things that you have for us. Just pray you'd be with us during this study. In your name, Jesus, I pray. Amen. All right, so we're going to jump right in, and we're going to read all of chapter 20. It's just one story, and we'll go from there. All right, Genesis chapter 20. And Abraham journeyed from thence. I was just thinking, I don't know where thence is. I was trying to look at the previous thing, but he was camped out near Sodom and Gomorrah, close enough to see the destruction. So Abraham journeyed from thence toward the south country, and dwelled between Kadesh and Shur, and sojourned in Gerar. And Abraham said of Sarah his wife, "She is my sister." And Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. But God came to Abimelech in a dream by night, and said to him, "Behold, thou art but a dead man, for the woman which thou hast taken, for she is a man's wife." But Abimelech had not come near her, and he said, "Lord, wilt thou slay also a righteous nation?" Said he not unto me, "She is my sister"? And she, even she herself, said, "He is my brother. In the integrity of my heart and in innocency of my hands have I done this." God said unto him in a dream, "Yea, I know that thou didst this in the integrity of thy heart, for I also withheld thee from sinning against me. Therefore suffered I thee not to touch her. Now therefore restore the man his wife, for he is a prophet. And he shall pray before thee, and thou shalt live. And if thou restore her not, Know thou that thou shalt surely die, thou and all that are thine. Therefore Abimelech rose early in the morning, and called all his servants, and told all these things in their ears, and the men were sore afraid. Then Abimelech called Abraham, and said unto him, What hast thou done unto us? And what have I offended thee, that thou hast brought on me and on my kingdom a great sin? Thou hast done deeds to me that ought not to be done. And Abimelech said unto Abraham, What sawest thou, that thou hast done this thing? And Abraham said, Because I thought, surely the fear of God is not in this place, and they will slay me for my wife's sake. And yet indeed she is my sister. She is the daughter of my father, but not the daughter of my mother. And she became my wife. And it came to pass, when God caused me to wander from my father's house, that I said unto her, This is thy kindness, which thou shalt show unto me. At every place whither we shall come, say of me, He is my brother. And Abimelech took sheep and oxen and men servants and women servants, and gave them to Abraham, and restored him Sarah his wife. And Abimelech said, Behold, my land is before thee, dwell where it pleaseth thee. And unto Sarah he said, Behold, I have given thy brother 1,000 pieces of silver. Behold, he is to thee a covering of the eyes unto all that are with thee. And with all other thus she was reproved. So Abraham prayed unto God, and God healed Abimelech and his wife and his maidservants, and they bare children. For the Lord had fast closed up all the wombs of the house of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. It's a story. First off, before I get your thoughts, what is this story recalling to mind? What should this be reminding us of? Yeah, the last incident when Abraham did almost exactly this same thing when he went down to Egypt. He's done this once before, and here we see him right back at it. Okay, so what are your thoughts? What jumps out at you here? So when it was still Abram and Sarai at the time, that they went down to Egypt, he had this same thing in place where they would say it's his sister, and the Pharaoh had taken her, and it almost reminds you of like a mini Exodus plagues. Like they had certain plagues befalling them for a period of time, and eventually they realized the cause, they gave her back, and they ended up giving him a whole bunch of stuff, kind of like in this situation, and just sent him away. Well, he ended up with Hagar, so I don't know if that's a win or loss with the way that situation turned out, but I'm pretty sure, I don't believe in the previous story this was explained, which is odd. I'll throw that right out there. The nature of their relationship is odd. Now, it's not until the time of Moses that a lot of the relational laws get codified, if you will. And, some of the stuff we were talking about last session about, like, the nature of how long they all live and, like, kind of the effects of sin on the people, even when we were talking about the propagation of humanity from Adam and Eve. Early on, different things seem to be functioning differently. And, yeah, because within several hundred years, this type of relationship is outlawed. Yeah, I feel, that's the thing. He did not tell the whole truth. I feel like if your kid tried to use an excuse with this similar logic, they'd still be punished, Yeah, I mean, kings can do whatever. We have no indication in the text. And honestly, just from the time period this is happening in, you don't have a lot of stuff like that. This seems to be an Abraham problem. Like, it's always, the way it plays out in the text, it always seems to be a lack of faith usually like right after a great thing that Abraham did. Yeah.
Do they ever explain that?
Well, no, it's just he has this fear that because they're married, if they find out that they'll want her so much that they'll kill him and take her. And yeah, it does, like we were saying, it doesn't seem to be a wide cultural phenomenon. Like it doesn't seem like a reasonable fear for him to be having. But yeah, we can dig in. Long enough that they were aware that no one in the household could conceive, which is interesting. Yeah, we don't really have a timeline on that, but something was off. Yeah, okay, so a little background here. So verses 1 and 2, when they start traveling, so the land of Gerar is a Philistine area. So they don't really give an explanation as to why he goes there. It's worth noting that the land that we typically attribute to the Philistines is within God's promised land for him. Like that's within the borders. They only existed, long enough for Goliath to be around because Israel was, failed to take all the land that they were supposed to. So this is technically, by God's ordination, this is part of the promised land. But he travels there for some reason. And yeah, we discussed how in verses 3 through 7, God intervenes in this situation as Abraham is committing the exact same very odd sin. And I believe the chief point that we're supposed to see in this sin is a lack of faith, a lack of trust in God. Like, he's believing all these promises of God, but not believing God to protect him. So he intervenes and saves Abimelech and Sarah. She's not in a great situation here either, of course. Verse 7. Now therefore restore the man his wife, for he is a prophet. That's not usually the description that jumps out at me with Abraham. I don't typically think of him that way. In what sense is Abraham a prophet? Yeah, he does seem to be conscious of God. So Abraham's statement of defense is, I didn't think there was any fear of God in this place. And apparently the point is he's wrong. So even just the way Abimelech treated Sarah, he took her with the intention of her being a wife, but for however long this happened, he didn't do anything, and he was trying to act in the integrity that he could, and he then listened to God. So I think he does seem to have some knowledge, I think. Yeah, an example I found in the book of Jeremiah, chapter 23, there's a section, it's against false prophets, but what you actually end up getting is a little definition of like a true prophet, saying, okay, all these other ones are prophesying falsely, but Jeremiah says, for who has stood in the counsel of the Lord, and who has perceived and heard his word, who has marked his word and heard it? So, and you get this especially with the major prophets, that the mark of a prophet is that you have been in the presence of God and then communicate God's message. So, especially with Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham interacts with God on a number of occasions, and then presumably talks about the promises of God. Like he's following the things that God told him in these one-on-one scenarios. He was in the presence of God and angels before Sodom and Gomorrah. So yeah, even though we don't think of prophets quite that way, because if you haven't written a book in the center portion of the Bible, then you're not that's what we think of prophets as being. But yeah, that's pretty interesting. So with the rest of that chapter, as we're kind of discussing the point of it and everything that's being done, so I think it's pretty important that Abimelech rebukes him for quite a few verses. Because again, Abraham is this chosen man of God. He is like we said, with his last sin like this in Egypt, he's supposed to be a blessing to the nations. And once again, because of his faithlessness, he is a curse to the nations. And he ends up being called out by a Gentile king where he said, I didn't think there was any fear of God in this place. And, well, it kind of turns out you were the one not fearing God in this situation. So it replays a lot of what happened in Egypt the first time he fell into this sin. And it leaves you hanging. But like I said, this is part of a literary sandwich, so we're going to come back to Abraham and Abimelech at the end of chapter 21. Okay, so let's move on to chapter 21. And we're just going to start with the first 7 verses. And the Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did unto Sarah as he had spoken. For Sarah conceived and bare Abraham a son in his old age, at the set time of which God had spoken to him. And Abraham called the name of his son that was born unto him, whom Sarah bare to him, Isaac. And Abraham circumcised Isaac his son, being 8 days old, as God had commanded him. And Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born. And Sarah said, God has made me to laugh, so that all that hear me will laugh with me. And she said, who would have said unto Abraham that Sarah would have given children suck? For I have borne him a son in his old age. So I know there's not a lot there, but what jumps out at you with that? What do you find interesting there? Yeah, so God visits Sarah. That's what we have in verse 1. Yeah, it's funny. This section seems very meticulous in just the ordering of things and reminding you who's who as if we haven't been reading the whole time. But yeah, so it says God visits Sarah. In some way, he allows her to have children. So, and verse 2 emphasizes the set time. He visited her within the set time that he told them. So if we recall, when Abraham first found out definitively that Sarah was going to be the one to have the child, he said within a year. That's when he fell down on his face laughing. And then he visited them apparently shortly after. Sarah heard this, seemingly for the first time, and she laughed about this. But yeah, so probably shortly after the events of Sodom and Gomorrah, probably within a couple months tops, because the timeline was a year. And we knew from before the name Isaac means something like one who laughs, which was sort of an indictment on both of them as they were not taking God seriously. And like you mentioned, the reframe of laughing. So in verse 6, and Sarah said, God has made me to laugh so that all that hear will laugh with me. Yeah, what do you guys think of that? I know, do you think it's a cop-out, like you were saying, or kind of trying to make herself look better, or is something else going on? Yeah, so the laughter that was initially a show of faithlessness in what God said becomes a laughter of joy when the promises of God are fulfilled. And Isaac is a big deal. Besides the fact that God's been saying he'll do this the whole time, but that's a big enough deal. It's a big enough deal that it's miraculous. And then this is the continuation of the chosen line. So Abraham's son Ishmael has already been on the scene, and we know this promise of the promised seed that will crush the head of the serpent is going to come through the child that Abraham and Sarah have together. So this is a big deal covenantally and just all the way down to Jesus, basically. Yeah, it's definitely a miracle. Definitely shows that. And also, I think, we discussed this way back with the fall, one of the consequences of the curse is, I believe the KJV is sorrow in childbearing. And we had a full discussion on how that, some people, or some modern things translate it as like pain in childbearing, but it's not pain in the physical sense. It's about sorrow and grief as kind of as the result. And then the next, the children Eve has are Cain and Abel. So you have like grief brought about by this process, and then Sarah is barren for a very long time. So there's grief there, there's hope, there's expectation, there's the promises of God, and then of course, well, not of course, you may not all know this, but then I believe Isaac and Rebecca and Rachel going forward, the wives of the next two patriarchs, all need God's intervention. So then it's sort of like God is the one bringing about his promise, like by his own hand. There's a lot going on there. Yeah. Yeah. That's a very good question, one that we unfortunately don't really have the answer to. So by the time Abraham and Sarah are around, I think Abraham's going to live to 160 something, which impressive by today's standards, but nothing like a Methuselah, Oh, was it 175? Okay, so it's hard to tell, because you would think, I'm going to assume something is not quite right. Like, what I mean by that is, you think, 175, cut that in half, that's like, whatever that is. Math's not my strong suit. But you would think like, normal male lifespan, at the dead center of that, they should like still be able to have kids if everything is good. But the fact that he's 100, which is a little bit past halfway, but this is still considered like, he's going to be a father? Like it makes so little sense to them that they don't trust God to do this, and like it seems ridiculous. So even though he lives to 175, him at 100 does not seem like he's just middle-aged, he can still have kids. It doesn't seem to be working that way. So I don't know exactly what's going on as far as that goes. Maybe they were aging and just like he just didn't die. I don't know. Like maybe I don't know. I don't have a good answer for you. I'm just rambling at this point. Anything else I can ramble about before we move on? Yeah, she was just a baby. Yeah. Well, yeah, and that's what I'm saying, because if he lives to 175, 100 is like just past middle age, so, but it's considered ridiculous that this is going to happen. So he's clearly not like your average 45, 50-year-old. Yeah, I think it still is, but we are way beyond the bounds of anything I can actually answer concretely here. So, next section of the text. All right, so just keeping our sandwich in mind. We had Abraham and Abimelech. Now we have Isaac. And now we're going to look at his other son, Ishmael. All right, so we're going to start in verse 8 and go down to 21. And the child grew, child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast the same day that Isaac was weaned. And Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, which she had borne unto Abraham, mocking. Wherefore she said unto Abraham, Cast out this bondwoman and her son, for the son of this bondwoman shall not be heir with my son, even with Isaac. And the thing was very grievous in Abraham's sight because of his son. And God said unto Abraham, Let it not be grievous in thy sight because of the lad, and because of thy bondwoman, in all that Sarah hath said unto thee. Hearken unto her voice, for in Isaac shall thy seed be called. And also of the son of the bondwoman will I make a nation, because he is thy seed. And Abraham rose up early in the morning and took bread and a bottle of water and gave it unto Hagar, putting it on her shoulder and the child, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. And the water was spent in the bottle, and she cast the child under one of the shrubs. And she went and sat her down over against him a good way off, as it were a bow shot. For she said, Let me not see the death of the child. And she sat over against him and lifted up her voice and wept. God heard the voice of the lad, and the angel of God called to Hagar out of heaven and said unto her, What aileth thee, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the lad where he is. Arise, lift up the lad and hold him in thine hand, for I will make him a great nation. God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water, and she went and filled the bottle with water and gave the lad drink. And God was with the lad, and he grew, and dwelt in the wilderness, and became an archer. And he dwelt in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took him a wife out of the land of Egypt. How you feeling about Abraham and Sarah in this story? Yeah, so the first time was shortly after Ishmael was born. Or no, he wasn't even born yet. Hagar had just gotten pregnant. It was Sarah's idea. And she grew to resent her for getting pregnant, being able to when she could not. And when she went to Abraham about this, he said, she's your servant, do whatever you want. And she starts being incredibly cruel to Hagar, to the point that Hagar, pregnant, runs away into the wilderness, where God finds her, or I don't remember if it was an angel or if it was God, finds her and basically tells her to go back. And yeah, now we have this situation. Yeah, how you feeling about our main people here? Yeah. Yeah. Now, I will emphasize that when it says bottle of water, don't think of your 16.9 fluid ounces, but it's not a lot. Yeah, so that's the thing that gets a little confusing with the language here. I don't think the word lad has shown up in this density before or since in any section of the Bible. It gets used many times. We usually think of that as someone like a little 7-year-old kid, the little lad. You still wouldn't say that nowadays. It's weird. So Ishmael is 14 when Isaac is born. Abraham was 86 when he was born, so that's the math. And Isaac is weaned. So yeah, I saw around 3 years. I think it's different back then. They kind of get you eating real food quicker. So, baseline 17, probably. So the word lad gets a little confusing. And then some of the language that's used, I think, implies a very, very, very small child. So, for example, verse 18, Arise, lift up the lad and hold him in thine hand. And when I hear that initially, you think, holding it in, a little baby. What I get there from other ways of kind of looking at the Hebrew there, people translate it something like hold him by the hand, hold him. One translation is hold him, hold fast, he's not doing well. Pick him up, hold him. Everything's going to be okay, as opposed to hold a little child. So yeah, the language gets a little confusing. But yeah, that kind of makes it worse, the fact that he's that old. Abraham's just kicking out his maybe 17, 18-year-old son. You understand why he was very upset initially. Yeah, again, this is probably 18 years later, and she still clearly has issues about this. Yeah. Yeah, she still hasn't gotten over this issue that she caused.
Right.
Oh, do you have a footnote there?
Yeah.
Yeah, so, okay, yeah, why don't we start going through the text? Okay, so Abraham's having a feast. Cool idea. His kid can eat solid food now. We're going to throw a party. Lots of food. But yeah, verse 9. So Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, which she had borne unto Abraham, mocking. Now, in Hebrew, the word there that gets translated mocking is basically a verb form of Isaac's name. So, which means like to laugh. So you could actually take it a few different ways. It could be that he's mocking, just straight up. It could be that he's laughing. And it could be that he's like making others laugh. And Sarah just had this whole thing of, after all their faithlessness, like, oh, people will laugh with me. And either way, it seems it's still rooted in jealousy of the situation. But especially in the Hebrew, there's wordplay going on there with, what Abraham and Sarah do, Isaac's name, and then this situation with Ishmael. Sarah clearly still has issues. So, verse 11, when Abraham is grievous because of this situation with his son, like he's very upset by what Sarah said. I'm thinking, I'm at least glad he's upset about this situation, because the situation we talked about the first time, when Sarah got jealous of Hagar's pregnancy, he did not seem to care at all what Sarah did with her. Like, okay, something's changed. He's grown to love at least his son. So that's good. Verses 12 and 13, we see God's plan to bless the seed of Abraham. Even though Ishmael is not going to be the chosen line that will bring about the prophecy, the Messiah, he's still being blessed because of his connection with Abraham. So there is, we talked about the kind of rushed nature of, he kicks them out the next morning. Like, did you notice that? No, there doesn't seem to be much warning here. There's obviously no significant planning of the provisions and stuff. Verse 16. And she went and sat down over against him a good way off, as it were a bow shot. I thought that was an interesting phrase. It's not something that comes up all the time. It's like how we would say a stone's throw away. And of course, we learn later that out in the desert, Ishmael becomes a skilled archer. And it's funny that they use the word bow shot to describe the distance there, because it doesn't come up that often. So they settle in the wilderness of Paran. That is, Paran it's in the south. It's closer to Egypt, which makes sense. And she gets him a wife from Egypt, her homeland. And for some reason they don't, you'd kind of wonder why they don't just go back to Egypt. Although I guess if she was given to Abraham and Sarah, she probably doesn't have, she was a servant to begin with, so I don't know where she would go back to. But she does go to Egypt and get him a wife there. So the Ishmaelites, we discussed this a little bit, they're known historically. So he will end up being a nation in that area, composed of also 12 tribes, similar to what the Israelites will be. But the name Ishmael, the Ishmaelites, show up in both Assyrian and Babylonian documents, and it gets used interchangeably with Arabs, like back at the time. So, yeah, that whole Arabian area that you think of in some form descends from the Ishmaelites. Okay, so we got 10 minutes left, just enough time. We're going to finish up the sandwich. All right, so after hearing about Abraham's two sons, we're going to take a hard turn back to Abimelech. So look with me in verse 22, and we're just going to finish out the chapter. And it came to pass at that time that Abimelech and Pichol, I don't know if you're supposed to do a PH sound there or not, Pichol, the chief captain of his host, spoke unto Abraham, saying, God is with thee in all that thou doest. Now therefore, swear unto me here by God that thou wilt not deal falsely with me, nor with my son, nor with my son's son, but according to the kindness that I have done unto thee, thou shalt do unto me and the land wherein thou hast sojourned. And Abraham said, I will swear. And Abraham reproved Abimelech because of a well of water, which Abimelech's servants had violently taken away. And Abimelech said, I knew not who had done this thing, neither didst thou tell me, neither yet heard I of it, but today. And Abraham took sheep and oxen and gave them unto Abimelech, and both of them made a covenant. And Abraham set 7 ewe lambs of the flock by themselves. And Abimelech said unto Abraham, What mean these 7 ewe lambs, which thou hast set by themselves? And he said, For these 7 ewe lambs shalt thou take of my hand, that they may be a witness unto me that I have digged this well. Wherefore he called that place Beersheba, because there they swear both of them. Thus they made a covenant at Beersheba. Then Abimelech rose up, and Pichol, the chief captain of the host, and they returned into the land of the Philistines. And Abraham planted a grove in Beersheba, and called there on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. And Abraham sojourned in the Philistines' land many days. May seem like an odd little ending to the literary unit. Yeah, I mean, we've met at least 2 kings so far who seem to know God in some way. This man has some knowledge. Of course, we met Melchizedek last season, who was a priest of God, totally disconnected from Abraham. Yeah. So verses 22 and 23, just the way it starts off, we kind of already said this. Just his interaction, him noticing that Abraham seems to be blessed by God. Everything he does seems to work out well for him. Oh, yeah. Yeah, no, this is the guy from earlier today. Philistine king is once again just proving very wise, man of integrity. And yeah, he notices what's going on spiritually. What are you going to say?
Very important to this captain who's mentioned twice.
I am not sure because, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, he has no real influence on the text. I don't know if it's interesting that he brings it's his captain, right? The captain of his host. So he has his main military officer with him, which makes you kind of wonder, was he concerned? I don't know. Here it was already pointed out, he makes a covenant with a foreign ruler, sort of. And here, there's no indication that anything bad is happening. Like, this actually seems, like we said, it's good for everyone. It seems like they're peace deals, they're business deals. Of course, this won't be the way things go in the conquest, which is, I'm sure, why you asked that question, if they should have made the treaty. Because by the time of the conquest, it was time for judgment. So they were told not to make treaties with anyone. That was not the case here. And in verse 25, it's funny, it goes from nice, peaceable talks to verse 25, Abraham reproved Abimelech because of a well of water. So you think okay, he's really getting nitpicky right from the start. But I think what we're seeing here is, so Abraham is finally just being honest with the guy. Like, as soon as they actually get this peace treaty set up, clearly Abraham knew about this. This has been an ongoing issue. And he actually just works with Abimelech and discusses this. So what I think we're supposed to be getting from this, it's an odd little story. And it's odd the way it's split up with the discussion of the two sons in between. So if with chapter 20, if we were supposed to be kind of thinking back to his old sin in Egypt, this kind of almost comes along as a corrective on what happened before. So he has this sin that should remind us of his old sin. And then we see the birth of Isaac. We see, even though we don't like the idea of Ishmael being kicked out of his house, essentially, he's now going off to do his flourishing. And then we see Abraham back with this same king, and he's starting to be a form of blessing to the people that he's interacting with now. So he makes formal peace with them because the blessing of God is on him. And right out the gate, he actually just presents things as they are. Hey, here's a problem. Hey, we can fix this. And they actually have a working covenant of peace, and Abraham ends up being a help and a blessing in this situation, as opposed to what he did before. So it's an interesting literary unit. It's not going to jump right out at you. But after everything that happened, he sort of this seems to be like a big turn. We've seen small turns, we've seen good events, we've seen setbacks, and then this unit seems to just kind of start putting him even more on the trajectory of the Abraham that we typically think of as the man of faith, the man who's supposed to be a blessing to the nations around him. Just for your information, I guess that's what most of this is, but verse 31, wherefore he called that place Beersheba, because there they swear both of them. Of course, if you don't know what Beersheba means off the top of your head, this doesn't make much sense. So I don't quite understand the Hebrew that makes these two meanings possible, but it tends to be translated as well of oath or well of seven, because he has the 7 lambs involved. I'm sure there's some technical wordplay that I don't understand. Beersheba, this well specifically, comes up with all of the other patriarchs, so Isaac and then later Jacob. This region of land is actually where, if you're familiar with Jacob's ladder, that whole incident takes place. Elijah ends up fleeing to this area when Jezebel is going to kill him before he moves on. And Beersheba is considered the southernmost territory of Israel. So in different places, like later in Kings, Chronicles, they'll talk about the land from Dan to Beersheba, as Dan is the northernmost tip of the country and Beersheba is the southernmost, like we might say, from coast to coast. Like we mean from the Atlantic to the Pacific. We're just talking about the whole thing. When they say from Dan to Beersheba, they're talking about the whole country. So that's just the southernmost tip. Anything else you want to talk about this text? I know it didn't end up being a short lesson, but we did cover a lot of ground. Some very important stuff happening here. Anything else we want to discuss or need questions about? Yeah, no, he becomes a great man of God by fits and starts and setbacks. And yeah, no, that is, I don't know if that's encouraging or... All right, I think we'll leave it there. Next week, we should see a big test of faith with Abraham. And that'll be interesting. But we can close in prayer. Lord, thank you for this night. We thank you for being able to study your word. I pray you would just continue to help us keep this in mind, help us keep the faith of Abraham in mind, and just whatever particular thing you would have us get from this, that we would learn to trust you well, to take you at your word. Lord, we just thank you. We pray you'd bring us back safely next week. In your name, Jesus, I pray. Amen.